Good afternoon everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to another vlog. To all the art creators, gurus, innovators, creative thinkers and entrepreneurs, welcome and thank you for connecting with me and watching this video. Now, as you can notice, I've got my trusty apron on, and I generally like to wear a scarf because otherwise when hair comes in my face it just doesn't really allow me to concentrate very well. So I've got my gear on. And what we're doing today, I think, is quite special. Now, in today's video, what I wanted to talk to everybody about is how to be a little bit more effective in what you do. So, you all know that I like to paint and I like to create. Now, for all aspiring artists out there, people that have painted perhaps for a while, I just want to share with you a couple of tips that have worked for me and ideas that you might find will make you a little bit more freer and looser when you are in your studio. So sit back, relax. I'm going to go and set up my little trustworthy studio corner, and I'll give you guys some of those tips as we go along. Okay, don't go away. Okay, so the first tip that I would tell anybody when they start to paint, at least from the experience that I've had, is to look at the kind of board or the palette board, whatever surface they have that they're mixing the paint on. And this is really, really important, and I'll show you why. If we have a look at, or if you know in the context of a colour spectrum, we've got our white, which is the most brightest colours, and of course our dark on the other side, which is the darkest colour. Now, when we start to mix on something that's white, what will start to happen is that that colour is going to appear a lot brighter. Whereas when we mix on our palette board that is neutral, or I would say darker, but not a specific colour, it gives us a better opportunity to then assess colour. The other thing too that you would have noticed is that my actual board is glass and I've got a black cloth underneath it. I like using glass in particular because it's a lot easier to mix colour, scrape it off, clean it, and then, you know, start a new day when I do a fresh painting. So that's my preference. Now let me show you what happens when we start to mix colour on a darker background surface versus when we start to mix colour, for example, on a white surface. Okay, so I'll mix a green colour and I'll show you guys what that looks like on this palette board that I use versus for a lot of those painters or new beginners that have bought themselves a white palette board. So if I take a little bit of cadmium yellow and a little bit of French ultramarine blue and mix that together, I've got a really good indication of what type of green I have mixed. Okay, that's pretty obvious, and I'm pretty sure you guys can see that really well on camera. If I was to now bring in my white piece of paper and I'm going to mix the same green, I want you guys to see the actual colour starts to appear a lot more darker. So I'll take exactly the same amount of yellow and the same amount of French ultra blue, put that on my white board. When I start to mix that, that green actually appears a lot darker. Okay, can you guys see that? So in actual fact, these are the same colour tones, but when we start to mix colour on a white surface, we are then basically comparing the colour that we're mixing to that white surface. Whereas when we're using a darker surface to mix our tone, it gives us that ability to have a far better understanding in the subtlety of the various tones, which is why I prefer to have a palette board that is dark, or at least glass, and I've put a dark cloth underneath it. Okay, so that's tip number one. Tip number two regarding oil painting is priming your canvas or priming your paper, whichever material you are using to paint on. So every single student that I've had coming to my class keep asking me, what's the benefit of actually priming your canvas, and is there any benefit? Now you'll see here that I've got a small canvas pad or paper that I have primed myself with watercolours. This particular colour here is a Pilbara red, and this particular colour here is a green, which, let me just get that colour, it's a green grey, or called antique grey. In essence, it doesn't really matter what colour you prime your canvas, but the benefit is again similar to our actual surface that we mix our colour on. It gives us the ability to assess colour a lot better, and I'll show you how that works. Okay, so remember the green that we've mixed here before? There's our lovely, beautiful, warm green. If I take a small portion of that green and add it to my orange covered background, I get a far better idea of what it looks like. Now, the same green, I'm going to take a small amount and then put it on my white background. Notice the difference in actual colour. The colour of the green on the white looks a lot darker versus the colour of the green on the red looks a lot lighter. Now let's take out the same green again, and if I add it to my grey toned background, now that green's changed again. So why would somebody actually prime their canvas or their paper? For the reason of wanting to create mood. A lot of artists leave their underpainting to come through to the final stage, and they want all of this underpainting to actually show. At the same time, from a beginner's perspective, you are able to assess colour tones with a lot more of a finer eye than what you would be if you were starting to paint just purely on white. So tip number 2, of course, is consider priming your canvas. Now if you're thinking, well, what colour do I start off with, or what's the best one? Most commonly used colour to prime your canvas is actually the orange, raw umber, raw sienna. I like Pilbara red, but again, it's that orangey undertone that's probably the most neutral and best to start you off on getting the better tones in your artwork. Tip number 3 is have good quality paint. Now you'll find that there is no need to use mediums or binders when you actually have good quality paint. Now I'm not sponsored by this particular company, but my preferred particular brand, which I'll share with everybody, is Michael Harding's oil paint, and this particular one is a Phthalo Blue Lake. Now I love Michael Harding's oil paints because they are made with natural oils versus a lot of other oils, oil paints that are on the market, which of course use synthetics. So I will show you the difference, for example, between a good quality cadmium red colour and a cadmium red that's made with synthetic oils. For example, this is a cadmium red colour that I use, which is a Michael Harding cadmium red, and it's incredibly rich and intense. I mean, the colour is just incredible. It's almost a velvet. If I was to take an inferior or a less quality type cadmium red and just assess it next to my preferred colour, I hope you can see that, it actually is a lot more orange. So this is the Michael Harding red, cadmium red, and this is an inferior brand of cadmium red. Now, of course, if you're starting out and you're wanting to do, learn how to paint oil, I'm not wanting you to go and spend all of your money on these particular expensive brands because they are quite costly. For example, a tube can set me back quite comfortably for about $200, so don't spend your money out just yet. But certainly I like to offer my clients and people that buy my artwork the best possible materials on linens, canvases, etc. that I can, because after all I'm representing my work and the quality of my work. So tip number 3, of course, is have good quality paint. Now tip number 4 is all about the palette and brushes. Now Everyone that has always keeps asking me that comes to my art classes, what kind of palette do you use, or the painting palette, not the actual palette that holds your colour. The kind that I use, I mean, they aren't basics. I really don't know any other brand, but putting aside brand, I really focus on quality. You'll notice that they've got a bent handle, and this is really important because when you paint and or mix colour and you put your palette knife against your board or your canvas, you want your hand to be clear from the surface. You don't want to be actually touching your canvas with your hand. I mean, it just gets way too muddy. The other thing that I like, of course, is ergonomics. It's really important that it's quite lightweight and it almost feels part of my wrist and my hand, so that's really important. The other aspect of a palette knife that I would say is my number one criteria is that it has flexibility, okay? And you can, I'm hoping you can see that. See how that moves quite freely and quite nicely. Flexibility allows me then to be able to mold that paint around the canvas, so that's quite important. Of course, you've got different palette knives that have got different kind of shapes and different sizes. Some of the others that I have are again a similar shape but just the bigger size. Okay, so palette knives are quite important. In conjunction with that, I would say the other important thing is to have good quality paint brushes. Now, for people that again have come to my classes, they're quite surprised that I use watercolored brushes for oil painting, but believe me when I tell you that I spend a lot of time cleaning them. So yes, I do look after my brushes quite well. Again, to give everybody an indication, this is a $20 brush and it's quite expensive for such a small brush. But for me and how I like to work, I love the way they feel and they're quite soft. This brush has had its day and it's been worn quite a lot, but spending money on good quality brushes is really, really important. And that would be my tip number 4. Tip number 5 is have order and routine. Really, really important. I remember going to classes years and years and years ago, and I remember the tutor always telling me to put my colours in order, as you can see up here from left to right. And I thought, what an absolute rubbish idea. But what happened is, as I started to paint and I started to paint with speed, I found myself not wanting to think about where my colours were. It became an instinctive move to pick up colour and start to paint. So having that order is really important. But how I like to lay out my paint is in a bit of a curve. Now this here has been a puddle of many things, so that kind of stays there for a while. But really in general, I've got my white, yellow, red, blues, and then darks, and anything else that I might add, or greys that I would have had from previous paintings that I keep on the side. So having the right order is again another important factor, because it allows your mind to be free to focus mainly on your artwork than to consider what colours you need to pick up, whether it's ultra, whether it's a cadmium red or yellow. You don't want to think about those things. So consider starting a routine of how you lay out your colours. Tip number 6 is start with a small painting. The problem or the challenge that we all run into straight off when we start to paint is we want to create these huge masterpieces. By learning how to paint small, you then learn how to be able to scale your work on a bigger canvas. So for example, something that is this particular size, which I think is, I don't know, about 15 centimetres by about 10 centimetres, is quite a good start for practicing. For example, if you just started to do an outline, I'm going to quickly utilise that green that I had in here before, of your subject matter, you'll find that you'd be able to control your artwork and understand how tones work far quicker than if you were to paint on a bigger scale. So let's, for example, do a quick tree. Understanding where tones are and movement of your tree then allows you to quickly block in your particular shapes. Do a small trunk. There's our ground. Let's work in a little bit of red into that and add a little bit of red for the trunk. Now see how we're starting to develop that photo, or sorry, that painting quite quickly. Again, working on a small scale is far more beneficial than if we were to start a big painting, which would require mixing a larger amount of paint, having brushes that are far bigger than that, having palette knives that are far bigger than that. So you see, you have to scale everything if you want to do a big painting. So starting off small is probably the best step toward learning how to paint, and slowly, increment by increment, then you can move on to a larger painting. Tip number 7 is working or starting with a limited colour palette. And by that I mean you need yellow, red and blue and white for mixing. That's it. 20 or so years ago when I started painting, and when my tutor told me that to begin with, I thought they were mad, absolutely insane. But once they started explaining the reasons why, it became quite obvious that I could mix any colours that I wanted from using 3 primaries. For example, if you're wanting to go and mix a purple, I get blue, a little bit of red, a little bit of white, and I've got myself a nice purple tone. Now if I wanted to add a little bit of yellow to that, and I mean tiny bit, now I've gone in creating a nice mottled green tone. Now in that same colour I can then add a little bit more white, for example, and now I've got a grey. If we then use the same concept of using now a larger amount of red and a smaller amount of blue, now we're going in the direction of creating a dark, or I should say a muted tonal red, which I like to use this kind of muted colours more in the distant background. If we add a little bit more white to that same tone, you can see again that we're creating a dusty pink. Same thing again, using the 3 primaries, we'll go into the yellow, we'll add a little bit of red, and now I've got an orange. If I wanted to lighten up that orange, again add a tiny bit of white, and now I've got a bright orange tone. So a limited colour palette not only expands then how we want to express a particular subject matter through using our creativity, but it just gives us, in actual fact, the opportunity to then rediscover and interpret a subject matter far better and with a lot more intensity and emotion than if we had a lot of colours up on our board. It just becomes a little bit too easy and predictable that we would have just gone into those colours versus mixing our own. So tip number 7, of course, is work with a limited colour palette. Tip number 8 is to work your painting from thin to thick. I know it's quite popular out there right now to have quite thick, robust paint put on canvas, and that's wonderful for artists that have got that confidence and experience. But let me show you, for example, and here's a tree that we did or showed you before. By starting off thin, and you saw me use the brush, and I'll just go back and use that again, if I just apply a small amount of colour on that, again, it gives me the ability to control how I apply that colour. Now, how then the thick portion of this painting would work is that we then use or start to incorporate our palette knife, and again, it comes down to experience. But the idea is that once you've got your tone of your subject matter, then we can move to using a thicker paint. So if I grab my green on my lovely palette, all I start to do is apply it with a little bit more of a, I always explain it like a cake layering process, but you can see how you've got a more richer, denser feel than what you had with the brush. Now these colours that I mixed just before in the other demonstration, I'm going to actually incorporate them as well. So for example, let's just take a little bit of that grey, a little bit of that yellow ochre, which I mixed using green and orange, and add it to our tree. And now what we're doing is we're working wet into wet, and we're mixing that grey into that green. Add a little bit of that orange into that yellow ochre and a little bit of white, and now we're creating some highlights which are quite more evident in trees around the Australian bushland. So can you see how, yes, the thick does work, but in order to start using thicker paint, it's really important to not set yourself up for failure and start doing a thin wash first with the brush, and then move over to starting and using a palette knife and incorporating thick on thin. And that's tip number 8, working from thin to building up your painting with thick paint. Okay, tip number 9 is being organized. Now, you have to make time for what you love to do. This is incredibly important. A lot of people always say, I just can't be bothered making the time to actually do what I love to do. Now, I'll give you guys a little bit of a hint as to the importance of being organized. When you have a routine, or when you establish yourself in a routine, what you start to do is that when you don't do what you said you were going to do, that you miss it. And you're wanting to then start that process of revisiting what your passions are. In this example is art. Now, if I was to ask everybody out there, when you think about Picasso's work, for example, most people conjure up an image of his Cubism period. But the fact is that Picasso did something like 1,800 paintings, 12,000 sketches, 1,200 works of ceramics, tapestries. I mean, a lot of work. He's only known for his Cubism period, but in actual fact, he put in a lot of time into what he did. And mileage is the key, which now brings me to tip number 10. You just have to go and do it and do it and do it and do it. We can't complain that we don't know how to do something if we don't actually put in time to do it. Being committed to something is really important. So, for example, as I said to you in a couple of tips that I shared with you, good quality paint, being organized, having things in a systematic order on your palette board, using the best brushes, the best palette knives. This is really a mindset, and when we have a mindset in doing the best we can with something, you want to then transfer that mindset in everything else that you do. So, for example, if I was to ask you, and I've just written this down because I don't want to forget it, if I was to ask you to say, you know, you've done a 12-hour day at work, and you come home and you think, oh, I'm just too tired, I can't be bothered going into my studio and picking up a brush and painting and doing all these things. The difference here that you need to employ in your mindset is to A, become organized, and 2, start looking at it with a different perspective. For example, walk into your studio and say, I'm just going to do the smallest amount of work, you heard me right, the smallest amount of work I possibly can, even if it's one line, one brush stroke, and then I'm going to go out. I'm going to do nothing else other than that. So, mindset. Go into your studio and say, I'm going to do the smallest amount of work that I possibly can. Now, what starts to happen is that, you know, you've set up your board, you've set up your colors, you've set up your easel and your canvas. That one stroke turns into 2, and 2 turns into 3, and 3, and so forth, and you expand and you're starting to paint, and before you know it, time is irrelevant, and that tired, achy self that you have just almost disappears. I mean, many times, I'll be honest, many times I think, I can't be bothered doing the video today. I really can't be bothered. I've got so many other things to do. And yet, I start to set up the camera. I've got the idea of what I want to share with you guys. It just starts to unravel. And before I know it, 2-3 hours have gone past, and all of these things that I thought were going to take a lot of time have actually not been that bad. So, be aware of your mindset and look at that thing that you want to do with a different perspective. Thus, the effect of what I mean when I say being organized is important, and having a different perspective with the way I look at things. Paint with quality. Give yourself with quality. Know your tools and how to use them to the best possible way. Incredibly important. Otherwise, you've just got the most expensive brush and the best studio in the world, and you're still unhappy with how you paint. If you focus on your tools, the rest really, it shouldn't even matter. And organized, organized, and organized, and dedication. Someone asked me the other day, what is it that why are you so energized all the time? You're like this, you know, Energizer bunny battery. And the thing is that for me, my perspective on life has become all about the now moment to the best of my ability. And yes, I'm tired some days. And yes, the other day I actually passed out on the couch with an absolute massive headache after an incredibly long day, early morning, long day. But I want to be the best that I can in that day, the best that I can do in that day. And once my day's over, I think, wow, I did great. Now what? And so my energy comes from that point, a confidence, number one, of confidence of many, many perspectives, which I will do a video on that in a couple of days. But a confidence of knowing that, man, I actually did that and I achieved it. I did the best that I can. But how can I now increase that experience to a new level for myself? Nobody else, just myself. So remember, get your foundation right. Focus on what you can do with your best ability, with the best tools that you can. Learn to be as effective as you can. And when you have that foundation right in your artwork, it will then start to bleed in everything else that you do. With all my heart, I thank you for watching. I thank you all for tuning in. Remember to create the world that you want to live in. And most importantly, be you. Until next time, guys. Bye.